Welcome back. In Chapter 4 of Wuthering Heights, we meet Nellie Dean, Lockwood's servant at Thrushcross Grange, who used to be a servant up at Wuthering Heights, and who Lockwood persuades to tell the story of its inhabitants. And again, we see a bit of Lockwood's city prejudice peeping through in the way that he describes Nellie. He's flattering to her, but he's surprised that she isn't dull and self-absorbed like most servants that he knows. There's definitely a bit of class difference that's coming to light here, and we'll see in upcoming chapters that class and rank play a large role in this novel. So, Nellie begins by telling Lockwood that Heathcliff's history is a cuckoo's history, which may seem odd to modern readers, because the word cuckoo today means something like crazy or wacky. But Nellie is referring to an actual cuckoo bird, whose distinguishing trait is that it will hide its eggs in the nest of another species of bird. And if that other mother bird doesn't notice, when the cuckoo hatches, it will take over the nest entirely and toss out the other eggs or kill the recently hatched baby birds of the mothers. So they're a type of usurper species. And when Nellie begins her story, we see that the metaphor is apt, because that's exactly what Heathcliff does to the Earnshaw household. So, Nellie begins her story way back in her own girlhood, where she's grown up basically right alongside the two Earnshaw siblings, Hindley and Catherine. At the time, her mother is working for the family, and she was probably allowed to live there, too, as a sort of junior helper, or junior maid. And the story begins almost in this fairy tale sort of way. Mr. Earnshaw is going away on a business trip, and he promises to bring his kids back gifts, anything that they ask for. But what comes back instead isn't what anybody expected. This is a sequence that shows up frequently in the tales about Cinderella, for example. So right before her father leaves on a journey, her two stepsisters ask for flashy, expensive gifts, but Cinderella always asks for something humble instead. And more often than not, in the telling of the tale, her father never comes home at all. Well, Mr. Earnshaw makes it back home, but he returns carrying the seed of his family's eventual destruction with him. A homeless, dirty young boy who he saw wandering around in the streets and who he's taken pity on. Now, the city where he had been was Liverpool, which was one of the newer industrial cities that had grown to prominence in recent years, as we talked about in the last lecture. It was also a port city, which meant large numbers of immigrants were arriving there, looking for work, and very often having little money. So at the time, poverty and homelessness was a real concern, and it wouldn't have been strange to encounter a wandering, half-senseless child in the streets, with no idea of who he was or who his parents were. So, Mr. Earnshaw brings the boy home, and names him Heathcliff, after a son who had died in infancy. And at first, nobody else likes him. But eventually he grows close to Kathy, and then to Nellie as well, after she nurses him back to health after being sick. But Hindley can't stand him. He begins to monopolize Mr. Earnshaw's affections, and this makes Hindley jealous and resentful. And again, this is where class and rank comes into play. Hindley is the firstborn son of a landowning gentleman, and he's the heir of the estate. And yet, this dirty, uncultivated gypsy boy is being given favored treatment. There's kind of a parallel here with what happens in the parable of the prodigal son in the Bible. Remember that the good son, who's always done what he's told and made his father and his family proud, sees his father gushing over his prodigal brother upon his return, dirt poor, unclean from working in a pigsty and disgraced. And he gets upset about the favored treatment that the father gives this prodigal son regardless. I imagine that Hindley probably feels the same way about Heathcliff. And so he starts treating him horribly, lording his rank and superiority over him, to the point where Mr. Earnshaw finally sends him away to a distant college, just to get him out of his hair and to keep peace in the household. Now, all of this time, we're certainly meant, I think, to feel sorry for Heathcliff and the unjust way in which he's been treated. But Nellie, who's telling the story, she undercuts that sentiment in the way that she tells the story. She says that Heathcliff is aware of his favored status, and it feeds his pride and his bad temper. Heathcliff knows that he can get others to do whatever he wants just by threatening to run to Mr. Earnshaw and tell. It's clear from these opening chapters that Nellie is a bit prejudiced toward Heathcliff, and we'll see why later. She has good reason to be, it turns out. But the dislike is so obvious that we're almost encouraged as readers to view the situation objectively for ourselves. Is he manipulative? Is he vindictive? At this point, it's kind of hard for us to decide. If we think he is, then we also learn that he's able to be manipulated in turn by Cathy. She has him wrapped around her finger, and this apparently makes Mr. Earnshaw mad, because Cathy taunts him with the fact that she has more control over Heathcliff than he does, who's essentially given him everything that he has. We don't get the impression that Nellie is all that fond of Cathy or Catherine either. She describes her as a naughty, uncontrollable young girl with a temper, but who does seem to have genuine affection for those she torments. She always repents of the mean things she's said or done afterward. Well, within the space of a few years, Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw both die, and Hindley comes home to be the master of the house with a new wife, Frances, who's also described as rather frail and as being of a nervous temperament. Everyone is kind of shocked at his choice of a bride, and I think it's because she's kind of like Lockwood, in the sense that she's an outsider and she clearly doesn't fit in with her new family or her new environment. Wuthering Heights is a sturdy, cold, and bleak place, and it breeds rough-natured, we might even say hard-hearted, individuals. Frances is frivolous and silly, and as the years pass, we see that the locals are right to be skeptical of her ability to survive in such an unforgiving environment. Frances has consumption, which was sort of a watchword for a number of diseases in the 19th century, including tuberculosis. And this was the same disease that would later claim Emily Bronte's own life as well. And we'll talk more about that in detail in the coming weeks. But Frances dies in childbirth. The strain had just been too much for her with her other sicknesses. And she leaves behind a young baby boy, Hareton Earnshaw. So this infant is the same Hareton who we've already met before, the wild young man who took offense at Lockwood's mistaking him for Heathcliff's son. But Hindley could apparently care less about his new son. He immediately becomes an alcoholic, and a violent one at that, upon his wife's death, and he becomes the terror of the household. Nellie does her best to keep Hareton away from him because she's afraid he'll hurt him in one of his drunken rages. Nellie makes the interesting comment that Hindley had room in his heart for only two idols, himself and his wife, and that he couldn't bring himself to love or care for another. Now, he isn't the only person in this book whose love, or whose version of love, is described as idolatry. Idolatry, we know, is the worship of or reverence for idols, false gods. But in its broader sense, it can mean the elevation of anything or anyone into the place of ultimate importance and worship in our lives. And that's a place that rightly belongs to God. Again, like with the cuckoo, it's anything that has supplanted our affections or turned them from their proper bent into another direction. And we see with Hindley how this isn't just a normal kind of love that he's had for Frances. It's a dangerous, diseased sort of love that actually makes us a worse person for having it. We might say that it's not even love at all, but covetousness or greed. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book, The Four Loves. How people will do things that they wouldn't normally do in order just to be with the person that they love, including neglecting or abandoning their families. And this is also why Cupid is often depicted as blindfolded in Renaissance paintings. Because someone caught up in the thrall of this kind of love doesn't see or pay heed to the other responsibilities and relationships around them. Hindley was so in love with his wife that everything else in the world held no interest for him, even after she died. And there's a sort of fury in his alcoholism. We get the sense that he's trying to drink himself to death as an act of defiance to God, because he's mad that God has taken away the love of his life. He even says that it's a pleasure for him to send his own soul to perdition to punish its maker. And this is an example of what happens to someone when their priorities or affections are out of place. Allowing anything other than God to become one's all in all just leads to heartbreak and to bitterness. And this isn't a mistake that's unique to Hindley. It runs in the Earnshaw family, we find. While all of this has been going on, Kathy has found herself in the middle of a love triangle with Heathcliff and her neighbor from over at Thrushcross Grange, Edgar Linton. Now, Edgar is described as kind of the complete opposite of Heathcliff, and in some sense of Kathy as well. They're both animated, passionate people, but they're also stern and gloomy. Edgar is a proper civil young man who can hold a nice, casual conversation, but we're told that he lacks spirit. He's quiet. Nothing ever really stirs him up. Kathy is understandably, I think, drawn toward Edgar because he's so different from the people she's grown up with. He has a warm personality and a friendly face. And Heathcliff, meanwhile, has been mentally and outwardly degraded by Hindley's tyrannical reign ever since his return. He's lost what he learned from the early education that he received from Mr. Earnshaw. He's treated as nothing more than one of the servants, and he's kept hard at work out in the fields all day. He hasn't been able to cultivate his mind, his imagination, or his manners. We read of Heathcliff that, Nellie's talking, of course. She says, in the first place, he had, by that time, lost the benefit of his early education. Continual hard work, begun soon and concluded late, had extinguished any curiosity he once possessed in pursuit of knowledge, and any love for books or learning. His childhood's sense of superiority, instilled into him by the favors of old Mr. Earnshaw, was faded away. He struggled long to keep up an equality with Catherine in her studies, and yielded with poignant though silent regret. But he yielded completely, and there was no prevailing on him to take a step in the way of moving upward, when he found he must, necessarily, sink beneath his former level. Then personal appearance sympathized with mental deterioration. He acquired a slouching gait and ignoble look. His naturally reserved disposition was exaggerated into an almost idiotic excess of unsociable moroseness, and he took a grim pleasure, apparently, in exciting the aversion rather than the esteem of his few acquaintances. So this goes back to the idea of sensibility and cultivation that we talked about in Frankenstein. Remember that Walton, the explorer, can't form a real friendship with any of his crewmates because they're uneducated and not sensible. In the 19th century, there was a real gap between those who were sensible or considered sensible and those who weren't. By driving Heathcliff out of the house and into the barns and fields, Hindley is sort of ensured that there's going to be a permanent wedge driven between him and Kathy. And Heathcliff knows this. He's planning to get his revenge on Hindley, and we already know that he has something of a vindictive streak, and so he's not likely to let that lust for revenge go. But despite all of this, Kathy still loves Heathcliff. even though she knows that marrying him is kind of a dead end at this point. And at one point in her life, perhaps that would have been okay with her, to marry Heathcliff and to be content with him alone. But now she's had a taste of the pleasures of the world outside of the moors, over at the Lintons' house. She's been shown what a more elegant, as well as a vain and shallow world looks like, and she wants that too. When Edgar proposes to her, she confides all of this to Nellie, and she tries to explain how she loves both Edgar and Heathcliff. And here, I think, is where her idolatrous love for Heathcliff is expressed, in the same way that her brother felt for his wife. She loves Edgar as a man, as an other, as a person who it's pleasant to be around. And this is perhaps a healthy, normal type of love. But her love for Heathcliff is all-consuming, to the point where she admits that she's kind of lost her own personality, her own self, in her thoughts of him. We read, she says, "I cannot express it, but surely you and everybody have a notion that there is or should be an existence of yours beyond you. What were the use of my creation if I were entirely contained here? My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt each from the beginning. My great thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be, and if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always, always in my mind. Not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It's impractical." So the language that she's using here is clearly that which would be appropriate towards, say, God. In fact, in Emily Bronte's poem, No Coward Soul Is Mine, which you should read, Emily talks a lot about this same sort of idea. She uses the same imagery to express her devotion to God, of the eternal rocks beneath and things like that. But with Cathy, all of that language is turned onto Heathcliff, to a man. And this helps to explain the dream that she tells to Nellie as well in this same scene. It's a dream that illustrates pretty vividly her misplaced affections. She says that she had a dream that she went to heaven. And then she continues by saying, "I was only going to say that heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth. And the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke, sobbing for joy. That will do to explain my secret as well as the other. I've no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven. And if the wicked man in there, Hindley, had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him, and that, not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning, or frost from fire." So she has this dream of heaven, and in the dream she chooses to go back home to be with Heathcliff, because that's her paradise. Her heart isn't set on heaven. The book of Colossians says to set your affections on things above, not on things on the earth. And Cathy's dream is a direct reversal of that. Home is where the heart is, as they say. And her home isn't in heaven, it's at Wuthering Heights. Now, this is a sort of obsession that it's probably easier to sympathize with than an obsession for scientific discovery and achievement, such as we saw in Victor Frankenstein. We can say undoubtedly that this is a dedicated and a sincere love. And it's even, a romantic sort of love. but it's not a healthy love. Because again, there's something a bit selfish in it. True love desires the good and the well-being of the other. And we'll see in next week's readings that both Heathcliff and Cathy, although they do love each other, are at the end of the day only concerned for their own happiness. We already see this a bit in Cathy. She wants the best of both worlds and actually thinks that because Heathcliff loves her, he'll want her to have the best of both worlds too. Now, of course, this is naive, and Nellie tells her that it is, but in Cathy's mind, it's perfectly logical. She sees Heathcliff and herself as essentially one being, soulmates. Why wouldn't he want what she wants? Well, Heathcliff has overheard a part of this speech that she makes to Nellie, especially the part about him being too degraded and uneducated for Cathy to marry, and he runs away without seeking any explanation. Nobody knows where he's gone to, and this brings on a mental breakdown in Cathy. She's delirious for a long time afterwards, and of course, Edgar is the one who's there to nurse her back to health, and in so doing, falls even more deeply in love with her. At this point in the book, Nellie's narrative skips forward about 3 years, and ends with the wedding of Edgar and Catherine. And all this time, Heathcliff is still nowhere to be found. So, we'll see where this story picks up next week, and for then, I'd like you to read chapters 10 through 14.